JNU academic for this often repeated opportunity for coming and being part of these wonderful debates. Only I think today we were discussing faculty meeting that some of you are doing great job against all odds, continuing this academic tradition of JNU and CPS. And I should also thank Satyendra because I really enjoyed reading this book. I mean, this is a very well written book. It makes for a very breezy reading. I did a one sitting read, so it is full of anecdotes. It combines certain conceptual history with everyday anecdotes, which is not an easy thing to do. Only anthropologists can do. Otherwise, we political scientists often write very boring stuff. So compared to that, this was a good read to make, and I enjoyed reading. And as I see, his central argument, which part of it I think he presented, is that there is a kind of an irreducible hybridization in the everyday politics. That the fact that Gujars can claim multiple identities simultaneously of being SCs, of being ST, of being OBC, and also of being Kshatriyas. So they can make, for a common eye it might look these are very contradictory moves, but in the what he refers to as the everyday life of the popular, to quote Satyendra's term, he says that this is not pronouncedly self-contradictory, but it makes sense for people to make those moves in terms of a process of democratization, in terms of pushing claims for access to resources. And he also makes some other interesting points in terms of Khichdi language, that Gujars speak not in English but in Hinglish, that they have a combination of English, Urdu, Hindi, and Gujri language. Therefore, they can invent neologisms in everyday communications, and that language matters in how they understand political process, how they understand democracy, and how it also determines the interface between caste and democracy. So I think these are some very interesting ethnographic observations about caste, the interface between caste and democracy. But my lament begins very early on in the book, is the very framing of the question. I would have something that so it's always good to enjoy a book that you might not have complete agreement with. After a complex ethnographic account, he ends up with a very fairly known formulation. With all his complaints with political sciences, end up quoting political scientist Sudipto Kaviraj, and he says that his formulation is to extend and in agreement with Sudipto's argument about upper discourse of modernity and of the elites and the lower discourse of the subaltern. So there are this fit between modernity and so-called tradition, and therefore the higher liberal Western modernity cannot co-opt the demands of the local. And therefore the local, in one sense, the way I read your book, is making its adjustments, which can also be, in your terms, also be read as kind of subverting the process to find more inclusion into democracy. So this is an argument that most of us in political science are familiar with. We are negotiating this argument. But my problem, some of the questions that I would kind of in an exploratory sense ask of you is in terms of why should we consider, or where does the fault line of the local begin? Why should we consider modernity to be external, imposed by the elites, something that flows top down, while something that is local is organic and vernacular and therefore in disagreement and in tension with modernity? So I will have very fundamental problems in terms of this very idea of local. It almost looks like the local is outside all forms of being determined. is local outside time and space. If modernity has a certain locationality in terms of class, caste, in terms of its social origins, in terms of its history, and therefore we assume it to be imposed from the outside, by default we are assuming that something that is local and vernacular belongs to the people, and therefore wherever the local enters, we are reading it as a process of democratization. It is democratization because it is questioning the process of modernization. Now I have a problem with this whole way of framing this question. Because what it does is it displaces the question of power. It displaces the question of power dynamics. It displaces the question of the fact that study of power is essentially a normative question. But the way most anthropologists and political scientists who borrow from anthropologists, in a lighter vein, Satyendra, I have a good friend in Scotland who is an anthropologist. I call him as anthropologist. That most anthropologists are apologists for power dynamics. That if one were to also believe, the larger point I am making is that the local is also produced through power dynamics. It is not beyond neoliberalism. It's not beyond the pressures of dynamic, of modernization. So therefore this simple way of reading that everything that is local is organic, and therefore this binary conflict between vernacularization and modernization, does it really explain power dynamics as to what is happening today in Indian politics? Which also takes me to your second point, that this very process of framing, how does it explain the shift of caste to culture and to religiosity, this process of culturalization of caste that we have been witnessing, which is the bedrock of rise of right-wing Hindutva politics today? Because in your conclusion, you refer very interestingly the shift of Gujars to Hindutva as some kind of an unintended consequence, if I am right. And therefore you end by saying that there are certain good parts of democracy where Gujars can push for more inclusive democracy, but the rise of Hindutva and shift of Gujar politics towards Hindutva as some kind of an unintended consequence. That's a very interesting term of using unintended consequence. It took my memory back to my student days of reading Robert Merton. It's a very functionalist language. Merton makes this point in terms of that there are intended consequences, but there are unintended consequences that flow in explaining functionalism. Merton refers to it and he says that how does one explain unintended consequence in terms of functionalism? So that's a very functionalist language. But I would want to push you more on this, that how do you arrive at this conclusion that Hindutva is it external to this process of vernacularization? Or is it an appropriation of the vernacular by Hindutva forces? Or one would, if one were to study it from the power dynamic frame, Hindutva is squarely rooted in certain social dynamics of the vernacular. You do refer to the masculine culture and some of those pointers you make, but you don't develop that argument. So again, this idea that something that is disturbing for the process of democratization is part of an unintended consequence. So I would want you to push more in terms of saying that can we really understand this shift to the right in terms of this binary tension between vernacularization and modernization? Or I would much to the contrary argue that it is in fact a certain kind of unholy nexus between the vernacular and the modernization that is increasingly pushing subaltern social politics towards right-wing politics. It is this aspirational mobilization towards modernization and certain power dynamics internal to the vernacular, across gender, across the relation to religious minorities, according to the way they have built their myths. All this is vernacular. And I don't see a reason why one should celebrate this just because we have declared it to vernacular. We are only celebrating it because it is anti-modern. And we've decided that modernization is all about imposition from the outside. Therefore, in celebrating what is local, and that local is precisely been appropriated by the right. In fact, it's not appropriation. That local is, Hindu right-wing project is built on the dynamics of the local. And today what is shown as an anti-elitist mobilization of the Hindu right is that modern project. And that is where I have my third question for you. That in your book you don't refer to Ambedkar at all. Is Ambedkar not a modernist? Where do we place Ambedkar's writings in all of this? Is Ambedkar not vernacular? Would we not consider Ambedkar to be vernacular? Because entire Ambedkar's writings, going by the markers that post-colonial scholars have written, and therefore post-colonial scholars from Chatterjee to Kaviraj have great discomfort on Ambedkar. They have not written on Ambedkar at all.
Chatterjee has written.
He's writing now. I don't know what is going, but we have to wait
Right
for.
from the beginning.
No,
Right
it's
from
Yeah,
the
that early book.
An
But,
entire chapter.
yes, but that chapter that you are referring to is a very legalistic take on Ambedkar, not a social history of Ambedkar.
But you shouldn't say that he has not.
No, but I'm saying that there is no social history of Ambedkar. There is no politics of Ambedkar there. That's a very legalistic reading, a very constitutional reading of Ambedkar, and even his recent writings, I'm told, is, but we'll wait on that. So, but my point is this, that there is a constant discomfort that both the question of caste and Ambedkar have created for the post-colonial. Because the language that Ambedkar uses of constitutional democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, the question of centrality of law, centrality of modern state, centrality of institutions. In fact, Ambedkar goes all the way to even be critical of civil disobedience in his 1950 speech and says that we have to rely on constitutional institutions. So is Ambedkar a modernist, an external voice? Is he not a vernacular? I think this dealing with it, and therefore most anthropologists dealing with caste question have a terrible problem with Ambedkar. I was quite surprised because dealing with that, why Ambedkar is such a missing link in your work. Why did you not feel the need for the entire caste question, and lot of caste politics, whether directly or default, are framed around Ambedkarite social vision. The very question of social justice draws from. But if you remove that history, and then while I agree with your conclusion that social justice and Hinduization today are not mutually exclusive, but that cannot be perhaps made sense through this tension between the local and the modern, and it is the modern that has distorted. Therefore, there is this kind of a shift, perhaps is not a very, very sufficient explanation. And that's where I'm saying that how do we look at culturalization of caste question that you talk about, the emergence of Samaj, of Gujars converting into, from an Ambedkarite perspective, which I would argue in your language would be, he's a high modernist. He's thoroughly Western. People have linked his writings to John Dewey. From pragmatism, he refers to quite liberal scholarship, and is in fact critical of everything that is local. So Ambedkar, who said that villages are dens of ignorance and isolationism, which in your frame would be a high modernist, regressive take on local culture. Unlike Gandhi, Ambedkar never celebrated villages, never celebrated local culture. All of that was problematic for him. And in fact, he said constitutional morality is that we do not have an ethic of equality. Even Aishwarya Rai's book on radical equality, he makes this problem that the fact that Ambedkar talked about freedom is because there is no concept of freedom in our indigenous knowledge systems. And therefore he has in fact given freedom to an unfreedom. That's his reading of why Ambedkar talks about, has introduced a completely new category into. And my final point would therefore be that that this study of the local therefore has also to be fixed in larger narratives. Because you somewhere also refer in your conclusion that Gujars in their resistance do not talk about resisting neoliberalism. This again I think is a very typical subaltern studies framing of ethnicizing the subaltern. That subaltern simply cannot think in terms of registers of these big questions. That they are all about this everyday question, this whole everydayness to politics. There is undoubtedly an everyday pragmatic turn, and it is that pragmatic turn which is linked to Hindutva politics. But does that mean that there is no normative concerns in subaltern politics? Does it mean that there are no ethical concerns in subaltern politics? Because sociologists will tell you there is lay normativity through which subalterns operate. And they are perfectly capable of raising larger questions. This was also a debate we had earlier on Chatterjee's political society. That this turn that the subaltern is now interested only in contextual negotiations. How would you see, I was also interested in seeing, how would you analyze farmers' protests? The farmers' protests, if you see, they have raised all important questions, including questions of financial capitalism, including questions of freedom of expression. They perfectly linked and raised what in conventional political theory we call systemic issues. So I think there are a lot of issues that we have neutralized in our this local modern kind of neutralized language that we have used, partly kind of I think made it kind of a flattened out our study of politics, and that we have pushed power out of the equation. It's all about pragmatic negotiations, it's all about everyday negotiations, and this itself needs to be questioned, even if it's empirically true.